then we'll go straight into the program. Right. So, hello and welcome. Hello and happy
Your
New Year.
mic is not that good, so you're very faint.
Okay, hold on. Is it better now?
You could be better.
Okay, this way. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you, but from far. Personally, I can hear you, but I can hear you from far.
Okay, all right.
But I can
Can you
hear
hear me
you.
now? Can you
Yes,
hear me
I
now?
can hear you, but I think it's just your computer.
Okay.
The mic is not that good, but it's fine. I can hear you.
All right, so let me just do a quick intro, then we'll get into the discussion, right? So hello and happy New Year to all our listeners across the African diaspora and the African continent. I welcome all our listeners on the various social media platforms to the beginning of the 2025 Sankofa African Global and Current Affairs webinar, which is normally organized by Beden Associate Consulting Limited, which is registered in the US and Ghana. My name is Benjamin Akwe. I'm your host for today, Friday, January 3rd. It is 9 a.m. New York time and 5 p.m. Southern African time. So basically, the Sankofa African discussion is a virtual platform, right, which brings together experts across the African continent on the diaspora. We all know that the African Union actually declared the diaspora as a fifth region. So the Sankofa discussion is more or less like a bridge, right, between the African diaspora and those on the African continent to be able to discuss issues affecting the African continent, and more importantly, in terms of great power strategic relations and objectives towards the African continent. So we've been doing this program for probably like 18 months now, right? So our discussion today basically started from last year. Our discussions today will be centered on country case studies, right? And activism, advocacy, and campaign by examining some of the sustained processes and strategies adopted by legal experts and practitioners on gender-based violence across selected African countries. Today, we are looking at Malawi and South Africa. So to begin with, we are going to have two different sections. The first section is going to be based on the historical development of national legal framework on GBV in Southern Africa. That is where we're going to focus our attention on. We'll try to situate it within the context of the African Union upcoming February convention, which is trying to come out with a comprehensive legal framework, right? So in order to understand this legal framework that the African Union is trying to bring together, we want to go to Southern Africa to trace the historical development of most of these national policies, strategies, and a comprehensive strategy that were adopted over there to address the issue of gender-based violence, right? Because South Africa is more or less the epitome of issues that has to do with gender-based violence or racial issues. The second section has to do with, we are trying to move the discussion away from human rights to human security. In this case, we are going to examine, right, case studies with our two panelists, right, from Malawi and South Africa to understand why, despite all the numerous national laws, comprehensive strategy and policy for tackling all forms of violence against women from a human rights perspective, there are still prevalence and to some extent no progress towards eliminating GBV in these two countries. So the first section is we're going to have our legal expert who I will try to introduce in a short while. But the second section is going to be our panelists. So they are going to stay in and listen to our legal expert, make her case or give us the historical development of some of these laws. Then after she is done, we'll focus our attention on the case studies in South Africa and Malawi. So let's focus our attention now on our first discussion or our first series, which I'm going to give some context, right? So it's the first section has to do with historical development of national legal framework of GBV in Southern Africa. So I'll give you a little bit background. On the African continent, there has been a rise in GB advocacy through sustained processes and strategies adopted to influence ideas, decisions, or policies. Violence against women and girls forms an important and critical aspect of the African Union Agenda 2063 goals and priorities, which calls for the establishment of comprehensive legal binding framework for the prevention and elimination of an effective response to all forms of violence against women and girls across Africa by addressing the root causes and drivers of such violence, strengthening legal and institutional mechanisms, and promoting a culture of respect for human rights, gender equality, and the dignity of women and girls. So I'm just giving you a little background. The need to trace the historical development of national laws and policy to address gender-based violence in Southern Africa has become necessary as the world approaches the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and the African Union upcoming February 2025 convention to draft a comprehensive legal framework to address violence against women and girls, right, which is happening in February, right. To help us delve into the historical development of national laws and comprehensive strategies and policy for tackling forms of violence against women and girls is a towering icon and a champion of women's rights, global and strategic law and gender advisor lawyer, Seodi White, right? So as the host of today's program, right, I took my time to do a little bit background and search on her, on our special guest today, right, in terms of her achievement as a woman rights activist, a legal consultant, practicing as a global transnational lawyer based in Malawi and spans across the African continent for the past 30 years. So I collected a lot of information about her, which I cannot share with our listeners because it's almost like 2-3 pages. But I just want our listeners to know that she has over 3 decades of experience championing this cause, and we could trace it as far back as 1994, right? Some of the things that she has done, right? In addition to some of the things that she has done, right, we can talk about international development.
Wait, when you turn this way, when you're looking like this, your voice is totally gone.
Okay, sure.
You know,
okay.
Yeah, like this, we can hear you, but when you do this, I think your mic just, yeah.
Okay, sure. So
yeah.
Our guest who is here now, right, has so many years of expertise and experience across the African continent, right? She's done a lot of consulting work, advocacy for women's rights. So she has a deep history and knowledge about the development of women's rights and gender-based violence in Southern Africa and across the continent. She's well known across the world as a global expert. I've listened to some of the YouTube videos, some of her contributions on CNN. So this is somebody who knows the issue very well. So we are very fortunate to have her over here today to be able to explain to us the historical development that we'll be able to understand what the African Union is trying to do this coming February. So to start on a lighter note, she's here, right? I just want her to give us a welcome address in terms of her experience working on these issues for the past 30 years before we delve into the issues at hand. So you are welcome, Madam Lawyer, to give us your welcome address.
Very good, Professor. Very pleased to meet you. We've talked this week, but this is, I think, the official face-to-face meeting. And I'm very honored to be here among esteemed colleagues that I can see on the screen. It is a great privilege. And yes, as you have said, I have been working in the business of law and particularly women's law and women's law reform all my life. From the time I graduated from law school, I went to the University of Botswana, and I'm a Malawian, but I studied in Botswana for my first degree. And from the time I got out of my classroom, all I focused on is women's law. And considering the time that I left school, which was around 1995, the continent was at it was at a pivotal moment when most dictatorships were falling. It was the fall of the Soviet Union, as you may remember, and most African dictators were being backed by the West up until 1994. And that's the same time I was getting out of school. So it meant that the laws that we had on paper were devoid of human rights because they were mostly built on the flow of the dictatorship regimes. So, except for, of course, for the country that I was studying in, I was in Botswana for 7 years. That's when I got my law degree. So the first time I ever heard about human rights is in a classroom at the University of Botswana. And the first time I heard about women's rights was in my second year of law. And I was so shell-shocked to hear that there are constitutions in the world which convey women's human rights. And it was a life-changing moment for me. To this day, I still feel the goosebumps of what that meant, that, Constitution can't protect women's rights. And coming from Malawi, Malawi was also falling. It was a dictatorship that was falling, and therefore it was an opportune moment to develop legal frameworks that were responsive to the human rights framework. And my life has been like that from that time to now, as a consultant, as a public servant, as a women's rights activist, as a researcher. It's always been about the law and the need for reform for the betterment of women's rights. So that's how I can introduce myself.
All right, thank you very much. One of our panelists says you are an icon for us, you are a role model. So after that, probably I will share your phone contact with her so that she will engage you. She says she's been looking forward to meet you, even though she's a Malawian, she knows about you, but she's never met you in person. All right, so I will try to do that later on. So let's get into our conversation, right? Now, I'm starting on a lighter note based on what I've read so far. All right, so starting on a lighter note, looking back at the over 3 decades of your career as a women rights activist, starting with you providing technical advice and leadership in the development and approval of Malawi's new public service bill, which had not been reviewed since its initial inception in 1994. What have been the biggest milestones of your career and some of the challenges advocating for eliminating all forms of violence against women in Southern Africa? What were some of the milestones and challenges that you faced with respect to the discussion that we are having?
Thank you very much for that question. Now, reflectively, it's always interesting that when you're in the moment, you don't think of it as a milestone. You just look at it as something that needs to be done, and you always know you're in a battle. So I've been lucky that so far, because if God looks after me, I'm hoping for more achievements going forward, different ones, but same. But I've been lucky that as I sit now, I've been an architect of 3 national laws that were conceived, from my thinking, as well as, of course, giving credit to some of the women that I worked with as lawyers, but as young women, feminist lawyers, just being really flabbergasted at the lack of effective laws for women's rights. So the first law that I ever changed is the Current Employment Act, providing for maternity leave. That was in 1998. I had just started this work. Maybe I was in it, but I started this work substantively in 1996. So by 1998, the Parliament called for a review of the law, and I made a submission to Parliament to talk about maternity leave and gave them a very good analysis, etc. In those days, it was very difficult because you couldn't find information. I remember having to scrounge through the library to try to find persuasive arguments for our Parliament. And maybe within 4 weeks of that submission, Parliament agreed with me. And they said, okay, we're going to change this law. To this day, the Employment Act of Malawi has maternity leave coming from that submission. It has never changed to this day. The second one is, that's 98. 2006, the Parliament passed the Prevention of Domestic Violence legislation. It had been 6 years in the making. Again, daring, young lawyer, deciding I'm tired of listening to women coming to my office and complaining about domestic violence. You know, I was like, oh my God, if one more woman walks through that door telling me about the domestic violence they're facing, I'm going to scream. Then I said to myself, surely something has to be done. Then at that time, again, Southern Africa, because of the South African democratization, was now socializing or peddling with some new laws from a human rights perspective. Luckily, that conversation also touched on women's human rights, particularly domestic violence, not gender-based violence, domestic violence, because domestic violence is a subset of gender-based violence, as you know, but a very sensitive subset, because up until the whole continent, nobody can lie to me, the whole continent did not want to talk about domestic violence, because the argument was you are destroying the sanctity of marriage. Domestic violence and marriage do not agree. Therefore, if it happens, we don't know about it because you are now disturbing things. Luckily, our colleagues in South Africa have started the work. And again, it was now emails. There was no internet. It was now emails. You know, we heard a rumor about this other group in Cape Town that is now working on changing the law. I flew to Cape Town to understand what they were trying to do. And it had just passed in 1996 in South Africa. So we wanted to understand what is it that, or how do you construct it? Because we've never seen a law like that. So how do you frame it? What do you say in this law? You know, we know domestic violence is bad, but what is it? And it was our sisters from from UCT in that project that took us through the whole process of this is how you formulate, and these are the challenges they were facing, because they had already started and they realized that it's very difficult to implement. And then we went to Mauritius. They had just done theirs that same time. And then Namibia, they were about to pass theirs. After Namibia, it was now Malawi. So we were the fourth country in the Southern African region to pass the prevention of domestic violence legislation, responding to now the clear crisis that we could see from my clients telling me every day that there's domestic violence. And when I went to the police before the whole South Africa trip, when I went to the police, I was like, how come you are not enforcing the penal code, which is the criminal code? You know, and it talks about assault, grievous bodily harm, you know, all kinds of egregious harm. Why aren't you enforcing when these women come to you and complain that they've been beaten or whatever? And they said, madam, first of all, if we arrest a man today, the very same woman starts coming to us the next day crying that you cannot leave my husband. And they would say, the women would say, I just wanted you to talk to him. I didn't want you to arrest him. So the police were saying, but we are not counselors. We arrest criminals here. We don't deal with talking and stuff like that. That's for other people. So it showed also the emptiness of the system, that it was not built to deal with domestic violence, and it needed a specific piece of legislation for that. Yeah. Right. Oh yeah, you've asked me the question. Okay, the third one, sorry, I forgot. Oh my God. Then it was inheritance law. You know, again, coming out of university, reading the Wills and Inheritance Act, I was also flabbergasted, because the law in its construction was a dispossessing tool. What is dispossessing? In our culture, now it's changing, but in our culture, the social or cultural norm is that a husband and wife are not related. Although they get married and they raise children together, each one belongs to their family. So in the event that their husband dies, and that in those days, we were in the unfortunate situation where HIV was also taking its peak, and we did not have ARTs in those days. So funerals were the order of the day. Every day you'd have to go to a funeral. And all that. And so if it's a man who died, and as soon as you're coming from the graveyard, the relatives are at the door waiting to grab, you know, all the property. or chase the woman away to say, this is our brother's house. This is our, Bisoso's house. So that in itself created also another crisis. So apart from the cases of domestic violence that I've talked about, earlier on, there were also cases of dispossession of the widow.
Okay, let me follow up on that. Let me follow up on this dispossession. Now, in 2013, I watched a video, a presentation that you did on TED Talk, which you coined the word legal pluralism in terms of dispossession.
Yes.
Can you explain to our audience what you meant? Because you were talking to a predominantly white audience who may not actually understand the cultural aspect of what you were saying. Can you explain to our audience what you mean by that law of pluralism? Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, so I should explain the law or the act, because I'll just explain the act.
The act,
okay.
The act.
The act. So basically, the psychology of the fact that so let me take, let's say if it's a brother, my brother, for example, and then he marries, okay? It will be a nice and happy family. Even me, I'll be happy to say, but the psychology of our culture is that brother is mine, is my person. Although he is married, they are not related, he is mine. I also want to say that is changing, but it is still underlying, right? Therefore, if I go to his house, I would assume everything that is in the house is my brother because he's a man. He's supposed to be the provider, right? So I would assume, okay, my brother bought this house is my brother's, this and that, right? Therefore it's ours. It's not hers. If my brother bought this house, it's our house. So in the unfortunate, and I don't want to put this on my brother. So this man, let's maybe now put this man passes on. My thinking would be, right, unfortunately, my brother has passed on, but whatever he built, whatever he invested in is now mine and the whole family. And if the wife is lucky, we'll give her something. That means I'll give myself the authority to say, I'll give her a chair, or I'll give her a spoon, or the house. And the law at that time, there was an Inheritance Act, was enabling that culture. That's what is called a dispossessing tool. It was encouraging and legitimatizing the dispossession based on the cultural norm. So again, as a young lawyer, having experienced that aspect, I told you with my professor, I knew this can't stand, and we had to change the law.
Let me follow up, right, with something, right? We know the writing of wills, right, and family law is something very new to Africa. Let's say it has been for the past 30 years. Let's assume for the past 30 years. But prior to that, it has to do with culture, right? Let's look at it from a woman's perspective, right? A parent's perspective. A parent who had to deal with colonization, right, has to deal with issues about raising a child, let's say a mother, who has to deal with this thing all by herself. Compared to the West, we don't have any kind of social welfare systems where maybe you have to take a loan or something to take your child, your male child to school. A woman has to struggle all by herself to raise a kid through all these challenges. And this kid finishes school, right? And like you said, you are marrying families, right? And this man becomes very, very successful. We know the role of witchcraft. We know the role of jealousy on the other side. There's the probability that the woman who is married to, right, her parents have, or her family has a vested interest in that marriage, that they can cause the man to die in one way or the other, for him to lose his property. Shouldn't the woman who struggled, the mother who struggled all throughout her life to raise the kid, have a stake in the estate?
That conversation, when we were now engaged in the reform process, because the reform process wasn't just like, okay, an activist wakes up in the morning and tells the whole country, this is wrong, We have to change it. Obviously, there had to be some kind of advocacy, even some kind. It was one of the biggest advocacy practices I've ever done in my whole life to this day, where we had to go district by district. We had to go to traditional leaders. We had to go to religious leaders. We had to engage politicians. We had to engage judges. We had to engage the executive, inch by inch by inch, to show them, one, the need for protection of the children of the deceased, as well as the spouse. Also, the disengagement of, because everybody say, but what about the mother? We're saying, but she can't have everything. Yes, she can have something. Or the parent, let me put the parents, they can't take everything because this person has now started another life where he has also got responsibilities. So what now came to a head was, okay, the percentage. How much would be the percentage? This is after 2 years of advocacy, where you had to change the mindset to say there are obligations to a spouse, there are obligations to children. Now it came to say, okay, how much can the law, what percentage should the law give to the surviving parents, the surviving spouse, the surviving children? So now, by the time the law changed, and this law took 12 years, the Prevention of Domestic Violence law took 6 years. But this law, because it was so contentious, so, divisive, that it took 12 years of advocacy to engage. So now it protects the widow or widower, not just the widow or widower, and the children in bigger terms, but also takes into account the parents. But it was 12 years of advocacy, and it was quite nasty, I must also say, to get to that. It was it's one of the most painful things I've ever had to do. Yeah.
Okay, right. So given the background so far, right, and look at what the African Union is trying to do, right, in February, and trying to come out with what? A comprehensive framework. This time, you're not talking about internal laws. You are talking about regional laws. We're talking about 30 years. 1995, we had a Beijing Declaration. In 30 years along the line, it is now that the African Union is trying to come up with a comprehensive agreement. Given that we have politics involved in the African Union, right? What do you think are going to be the challenges, right? The challenges, because let's see, the African Union, we know is more or less like a boys' club, right? With men who have entrenched positions, right? What do you think are going to be the challenges, right? Given your own experience that in some areas it took decades for them to be able to come up with laws. What do you think after 30 years, are we going to wait for another 5 years, another 10 years after Beijing Declaration? What do you think is going to happen? Can the law be passed this year, or we should not look forward, let's assume 5-10 years along the line before the law can be passed?
Tell you what, the convention, the draft convention on elimination of violence against women and girls, yes, it's coming in years after most member states have created these violence law, domestic violence, some of them GBV, because most of them, it was domestic. What was very contentious in our time and over the years has been domestic violence. What is becoming more and more contentious now is the whole framework of GBV because of issues that are emerging, such as you know, femicide. That's not a domestic violence issue; it's a public issue, but it's a GBV issue. It's a violence against women issue. Cyber violence. Most women are horrifyingly facing a lot of violence using digital violence, if I can use that way, yeah. And that's not private, that's also public. So the framework is slightly changing. Whilst domestic violence issues remain very important, but there's another layer that is now emerging because of economic issues, also because of even the cyber world. Women are getting killed, children are getting killed, and then we have if there's a woman who has dared to engage, whether to voice her opinions in a consistent manner or on a difficult issue online, if she has not faced violence, she's very lucky. I can challenge because I have faced it. Like persistent, horrible violence online, where you actually worry about your life. Most women that I know have, even if you want to, because online world also creates an economic opportunity to create, a livelihood. As you know, it's a new world. Women are scared to engage the online world and make a living because they're worried about violence, digital violence. So it affects livelihood. What I'm trying to say, therefore, it's the African Union, my understanding, if you look at some of the documentation, if you look at, for example, the Maputo Protocol, it is one of the most advanced documents on the continent and, globally. It's a 2003 document, very advanced, the affirmation of women's rights. And if you look at the African Charter itself, if you look at how it constructs the rights and compare it with other charters from other continents, the African Charter one is very well constructed. The rights angle, it's very crisp and well constructed. Now let's come to this. It will be therefore interesting to see how February comes, how it's going to go. It's never too late, and I think, yes, there's been a long debate, but it's actually quite unusual because African Union has been a champion. Look at the charter, I've talked about the charter and the Maputo Protocol. It is a protocol to the African Charter, on women's human rights. So it is a protocol for women. So we just have to hope, support, and ensure that this particular convention goes through, it's so far from what I have seen, it's very comprehensive in that it deals effectively with the modern issues that I've mentioned that we as African women are facing. So it's, I would say, very interesting. And there are so many players supporting it. I know for sure, UN Women, for example, has stood behind this and supporting the AU to come up with this, and I think they'll do a good job. But it's a very interesting time because the violence that we are now facing as African women is unprecedented.
Okay.
And this seminar, before you finish, this seminar, when we were talking about doing it, I felt like crying to say, I can't believe 30 years after we started this work, we are still talking about gender-based violence against women in Africa. I almost shed tears to say, I can't believe this is happening. Because for some reason, I thought we'll be talking about something else.
Yeah, that is where I'm going now. So with my next question, I'm going to give you, there are those who hold the view that a quick review towards the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration of presenting the issue of GBV from a human rights perspective and cultural perspective through intersectionality theory, right, and survivor-centered approaches. Not much has been made. Some are of the suspicion that GBV is now big business for NGOs and CSOs and the Western agenda on a piecemeal basis. Then to influence policies, right? They are doing this on a piecemeal basis to influence policies on LGBTQI, right? So that is why you see that delay and that's pushback. So they are making the argument that it's time to move the narrative away from human rights and take it into the realm of human security. Because if you look at human rights tend to affect individual women. But if you present it as a human security issue, it does not only affect women, it affects the society, the community, and the state as a whole. So isn't the time to move the narrative after 30 years from human rights, right, which people see to be a Western agenda based on LGBTQI, to something which is a security issue that affects the peace, development, and security of the state?
Security. Security is a human right. You know,
okay,
in
Alex, okay, go ahead. Somebody is intruding. Can you pause?
Yeah, there's somebody interfering, so it's difficult.
Alex, can you pause the person for us? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Oh my goodness. I think it's Patrick. Patrick is his mic is on. Yeah, that's right. Good. That's right. Good. So let's talk about what we mean by human security. If you look at constitutions, Jesse, I think it's Jesse as well. Jesse is also, her mic is not muted.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sending Alex a message to mute them. Go ahead.
Okay. So if you look at the human rights frameworks, not just the framework, if you look at the human rights frameworks, both at constitutional level, that is at domestic level, you know, and then at regional level, and then at global level. Let's say in the case of women's rights, the global document that we all, you know, rely on from an obligatory perspective is the Cedo, right? Yeah. The Cedo still remains a highly comprehensive document which has been reinterpreted over and over using the committee and the state party reports, right? So if you look at this, the international legal document like Cedo, if you look at the regional documents like the Maputo Protocol, for example, if you look at some of the SADC, Southern Africa Development Corporation legal documents. Within the framework of security is the framework of human rights, because human security is about human rights. Why should the world worry about human security? They should worry about human security because it's about rights. Security, the right to security, you know? So the language might sound a little bit more, how can I say, a little bit more public, more people-centered than human individual-centered, because if you talk about protection of human rights, mainly it's about personal rights, right? Yeah. If you talk about security, everyone, because if I'm looking for security, then you're looking for communal, it's a community thing. That's why, so I think the conversation that I've heard of recent to say, let's talk about human security and not just human rights. For me, I would say let's look at both. The fear, and we have to be very careful how we want to move away from some of these words, because there's still people who don't believe that as women, we're entitled to our own personal security, our rights. That's why maybe the word security say, oh, you women are too special. You're not that special. We don't want to protect you. Let us protect the whole community. But we say we have to be seen. I deserve to be respected as a human being.
The reason why I'm making this conversation is that the moment you mention the word human rights, the men are dismissing, oh, you this woman, right? The moment you frame it as human rights and you mention human rights, men become very dismissive and use the word, all these women. But if the narrative changes to be a human security, now you are creating that awareness and consciousness for them to take a second look at that dismissive language of these women. What do you think about that?
As a feminist, I think we have done enough over 100 years to accommodate men's insecurities, men's, standards attached to us. And the world still demands that we lower our standards even further so that we don't threaten men. How long can we do that for? The obligation is upon men to rise to the occasion and recognize us as we recognize as human beings worthy of human rights of protection, because that's what we want. We want these legal instruments to protect us through mentioning the acts that are criminal, holding those who engage in those acts accountable. How do you hold them accountable? By ensuring that the court systems are working, whether they're customary courts or they're statutory courts, they are working to protect us. How to ensure that courts are working? Member states, countries all over the world have to put in place budgets aimed at building capacity of courts so that they understand the human rights framework as well as the domestic legal framework, and that they actually enforce them, and that their plans, their strategies aimed at ensuring that this happens. It is not for us to lower our standards to say, okay, maybe if we design the laws in such a way that you don't see us as humans, but as a community, maybe you listen to us. We've done that for over 100 years, and look at where we are. We're still getting killed. We're still getting insulted online. You know, no, Prof, no, we're not going to do that.
All right. So, given your explanation to everything, we are now welcoming questions from our participants, right? Before we close this section. Now, this is a question somebody is asking: what are we doing to deal with two challenges: enforcement of the law and lack of support for survivors? Right. Now, the point is that the African state itself is already challenged in terms of revenue allocation, because we know that just recently, we have gender ministries across African countries, and some of them do not even have allocation because the state does not generate enough revenue to allocate these things. How does the state, because the state is always called upon, given its history, right? The state in Africa has evolved over the years, right? It has to fight colonialism, it has to fight this and this and this. It doesn't have the revenue. Now it's being called upon to provide all this support. How can the state deal with all these challenges?
Ironic, Prof. I've done an analysis of several government ministries in Africa, those dealing with women's rights and gender equality, and their resource allocation and their standing, you know, the hierarchy of power within each country. Isn't that ironic that, okay, governments, they are all struggling with allocation of resources, etc. But how come in all of these countries that I've studied, it's mainly the Ministry of Gender that is the most under-resourced in Africa? Everywhere, it's almost like it's almost like a game. Every Ministry of Gender is under-resourced in Africa. And in the hierarchy of power, it's at the bottom. You know, the Minister of Gender is never regarded as one of the powerful ministers.
The cabinet minister.
Yeah, exactly. They are on the side. It's almost like, in fact, I've always said, why do Ministers of Gender act? Why do African countries put Ministers of Gender as? By the way, oh yes. Oh yes. Your Excellency, you need to put in the Minister of. Don't forget the Minister of Gender. At least it should be on paper. But it is dealing with, in all the countries, about 52% of the population, you know, the ones who are actually in the care economy. So is it about the fact that states do not have money, or really states are not very interested and keen to support gender ministries? Which one is it? Because it can't all be uniform that all states, maybe with the exception of one or two, that all gender ministries are under-resourced. They are dependent on NGOs to work.
Correct. So recently, let me give the case of Kenya, right, where Ruto had to dissolve the government and reshuffle it and put people in place. When the reshuffle was done, right, gender ministry was left out without a substantive minister. Then when you go to Cameroon, right, the budgetary allocation was very, very little. What do you think accounts for this? Is it that it is for the African, it is a non-issue, that gender-based violence is a non-issue to them? Or is it as a result of lack of education?
No, it's the fact that even up until this day, despite the conversation that some of us and many of my sisters have put on the table for women's rights are still tolerated. they are not seen as the integral part of development. So for those of us who sit at these tables engaging in women's rights, we are still the fighters. We are not equals. We still have to fight to get women's issues on the main big table because they're still considered to be non-issues. They are tolerated and not accepted. And you know, when a child, a stepchild is being in the family, that they're being tolerated. If there are 10 children, and this one is just because the father likes this child, but let's just pretend that this child, and then when the father is not looking, you give the child a little bit of small food. In my country, we call it in sima, small sima, and a little bit of chicken, just a small piece. Because you're like, at least the child will survive, but will not thrive. That's how women's rights are treated.
All right, so we are still waiting for questions from some of our participants. Then let me give you my personal experience, right? I'm in the area of international relations.
Prof, can I just ask you, I just want to put on this, it's raining heavily here all of a sudden, so I can't hear you. So allow me to put on my headphones.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. All right. Yeah, we are expecting questions from our observers, right? I'm just giving you my personal experience. Even though I'm in the area of international relations, international security, I've never taken time to look at women's rights, right? Until recently, when I became the lead research consultant for a USAID Kofi Annan partnership, that I begin to read about it. So me, myself, as an academic, right? I didn't see this as an issue. So just imagine those on the low level, right? As an academic who deals with international issues, for me, it was a non-issue. So just imagine the politicians who are looking at for their interest, right? They are not looking at, we shouldn't assume that the politicians are rational. They are looking out for the welfare of the people. We should look at them, they are looking at for their interest. So how do you change that? That even me as an academic, it was a non-issue for me to talk of the politicians and to talk about those who are not educated on this particular issue. Do you change the narrative?
Actually, I'm so glad you asked that question. I had a conversation recently with some of my colleagues, and the reminder I was giving my colleagues is that in 1995, when we first came back from Beijing is when we created the platform for action, which we are celebrating this year, 30 years after Beijing in 1995. I just finished my law school then. But I'll tell you what, the moment I was catapulted into work, in the women's rights area, the first thing that was done was gender training. They were designing of various courses on gender training. That's how I learned gender. I didn't learn gender, apart from, I've talked about the human rights-based approach. I've already mentioned that I learned in year 2 of my law school. But the skills to analyze gender, to do gender and development, there were small courses that young people like myself were catapulted into. As soon as I started this work, I was flown to Netherlands at the Royal Tropical Institute, 3 weeks of doing gender analysis and gender mainstreaming. And there were so many African girls there and some Asian girls, some of whom are my friends to this day. Now, we came back and then started gender training. We were constantly training ministers, judges, all these players, gender training, gender was the norm. Now, after some time, of course, funds started becoming thinner. The conversation started dwindling. People started feeling a sense of saturation about this. But also something else happened. Those people who had trained us began to retire, particularly in the ministry. New officers started taking over. Some, they found the architecture still very relevant to train and support government architecture on gender. Some, they found the records are gone. These days, if you enter also a gender ministry, because also they don't have funding and they don't have the capacity to lobby for funding, you find that the officers, they don't know what gender is. Yet they are calling themselves, this is a senior gender officer, this is a You know how those expressions, this is a senior gender officer, this is a so-and-so gender officer. Okay, gender officer, I'm here to ask you as a consultant myself, I want to understand how many women are able to do X, Y, and Z. What is your plan with regards to the economic issues? You know, whether let's say women, you know, what is your economic plan for women? Are women able now with this economy? We want to know if women are able to win contracts. You know, and the laws now. What are the laws like? And they're like, oh no, we don't have resources to do all that work. It's a lot. And I also need training to do that because I don't know. That's Malawi. Go to Uganda, find the same thing. Go to Kenya, I can challenge you, find the same thing. TZ, you know, Botswana, all that. You find new officers who now are just pushing paper. They do not have that commitment to re-engage. So you have parliamentarians who are also not very sure. Some might feel that they want to support this gender agenda, but they don't know how, unless an international organization like the International Parliamentary Union or the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association or the SADC Parliamentary Forum engages this parliament, but how many can be engaged? So we have a dearth of expertise within our government ministries, you know, on gender, even within our NGOs. Most young people who are now officers, program officer for this, they're just trying to do the boxes because their donor has said, tick this, and then after that, the system has to move in order to produce funds. You know how it is these days. If you work in the system, you are working with software, and you find officers are busy trying to make this system work so that it can produce funds. They should go into the field. They are not experts, you know, in this. And apart from having expertise, you have to have expertise to engage with senior people, to engage with parliamentarians, to talk to judges. That's what we used to do. President, you ask for an appointment with the head of state to say, I want to see you. What's wrong? No.
Yeah, for people now, they see it as big business, right? It's like it's a game in town now that if you are a gender advisor or gender advocate, that's a quick way of making money and rising to the top.
And that's the sad part. You know, I'm not going to say yes or no, but I'm going to say there's definitely no expertise. You can even have a degree, but let me tell you, as a young lawyer, I did not fear a head of state. I made friends with the head of state and say, sir, me, I'm not happy. Why are you not happy? Then I will explain to him to say, this is what is happening. And you find that genuinely, he didn't know. Like, oh, I think that my minister didn't tell me. I'm like, ask her. We need to have this, we need to have this, we need to have that. I've sat in a cabinet meeting where I was just an activist. They're asking me to say, can you tell me what you were, can you tell everybody in here what you, and I'll be like, yeah. And I will explain the agenda. And people will see things changing. They wouldn't know that someone was in the throes, in the hallmarks of power, trying to fight for them. That's what we need. And I keep saying to my friends, my young friends, to say, don't think this is an easy task. It's very difficult. It was difficult then, still difficult today. Okay. You know, it's a very, very difficult job. I must really say, it's not for the faint-hearted.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. We thank you so much for bringing this understanding in terms of the comprehensive laws across this country. Now, we want to look at our panelists, right, who are going to present case studies in Malawi and South Africa. So what we do when we come to the panelists, we send them narratives. The narratives are based on research. They are based on realities prevailing, and they are based on policies, right, so that they can present their thoughts independently. So I've already sent the narratives to them. So we have Irene for from Malawi. Then we have Celine from from South Africa. So let's go. I've sent the narratives to them. So I'm now going to question them based on the narrative, right? So let me try to deal with Irene first, right? Malawi has a lot of laws, policies, which I can go through all them. We have the Constitution of the Republic of Malawi, 1994, the Penal Code, 1929, the Traffic, the TIP, 2015. So we have all these laws, right? The Marriage, Divorce, and Family Relations Act. Now, my question to you, laws are made to punish and to serve as a deterrent. But despite all these laws, cases of GBV still occur in Malawi. Women and girls, especially those with disabilities, and in need of care suffer GBV the most. In the district of Lilongwe, where the Gender and Justice Unit, which uses the law to respond to GBV in Malawi, as expressed in the narrative that I sent to you by the Lilongwe district gender officer, she said there has been an increase in GBV 6859 cases from April 2023 to April 2024. What accounts, how can you explain that with all these laws, given the background that our special guest has given, with all these laws, what accounts for these increases in GBV cases?
All right, thank you very much. I think my response will start from Seodi's work. In as much as a country, we're saying there's a rise in GBV cases, but also somehow we see it as now people knowing that this is what gender-based violence is and being able to report. Because the work that Seodi and the women's movement in Malawi has done for over 30 years has now made it possible that people have now started to know that this is gender-based violence. This is a child protection issue. This is issues affecting women. So it has now moved, like you said, it has now moved from a more private space to a more public in a way. Like you already said, that now it seems more that NGOs are the ones that are doing most of the work. I'll cite an example of child protection issue. A local organization came up with government to come up with child protection hotlines, gender-based violence hotlines, which the whole nation can use. And it got to a point that now people started to know that, oh, you're not supposed to engage in sexual activities with a minor. And then they even got to a point where when you see someone that's very young and then someone is saying something that's seemingly off, they would refer to it as Yoneko, being that organization, to say that, don't do that, Yoneko is going to do this to you. So one, it's an issue of now people know that they can be able to report. People know that, yes, they might find help, in as much as, yes, the help is not enough. Like the question that came in to say that the survivor-centered approach, yes, someone will go and report, but they will probably not get an after help, enough psychological first aid. They'll say that I'd rather go back because what happens if I'm now taken away from the financial space? Another reason is the issue of poverty. So now that different pandemics are coming in, there are new forms of violences that are coming in. When COVID hit, schools were closed, girls were sent back to their homes. There were actually numbers that alluded to say that since schools closed, these are the numbers of child pregnancies that came about during COVID, which were a high spike. To say that even in the homes, girls are not protected in the homes. And then now with the surge of the internet era, like Seodi said, there are new forms of violences that are coming in the political space, women being in the political space. The lack of representation of women in the spaces is also contributing to such issues. Because like she said, any woman that gets to speak in the public space about violence, they will call you an angry feminist, a man-hating woman, and people usually try to pull back. So women will say, I would rather not be in the political space because I prioritize my peace. But the lack of that representation in that space also means that when laws are being designed, most of the voices of women, because women are not homogeneous, we're heterogeneous. There's so many different types of women, and with different classes, and also the differences in ethnicity and all. If you look at the Afrobarometer that was shared in Malawi, you look at that there are some regions that seem to at least be faring a little bit better, and that also shows an issue of we do not do social norms diagnostics. Because if you look at the regions that seem like, oh, this is a region that is better off, that's a region where it is highly matriarchal. So the southern part of Malawi is very matriarchal. passage of land ownership is through the woman, in as much as men have control over it. But women are able to say that, you know what, I'm leaving this situation. You can leave, because a man follows the woman then. If you come to the central, it's a little bit mixed. Yes, you find the matriarchal system there, but then there's also the patriarchal side. That's why the central is also like a little bit in the mix. But if you go up north, that's very highly patriarchal, where land ownership, capacity building of issues do not go directly to women. So you get to see that those issues get to be there, and the voices of women are also get to dwindle when you change through the systems. Yes, in both the systems, it's still not okay. But the social norms diagnostics, when we're doing our laws, I'll give an example of the new law that just came in, the land ownership, so that at least women can be able to know to own their own land. But there's an issue where we felt like, oh, no, there's something that we probably miss. What about women from the matriarchal side? If we say that they're the ones that own land, let's say the woman gets to divorce and then the land is shared. Yeah, you share with your spouse, and then that one goes, and then another one comes. Now you keep on sharing the land, and the woman is the one that mostly remains with the children because of the social setting. What does that mean then for the matriarchal side? Even the other laws that are there, you mentioned the issue of what about the mother who raised a child? How do they get to benefit? If you look at maybe from the Islamic jurisprudence kind of space, they put percentages of this is how much can be done when you're writing wills. But that knowledge, in as much as laws are there, another reason why these issues are still going on is the ignorance of people. The literacy levels, the problem of literacy levels in the country. Yes, NGOs are doing a lot. The government, like Seodi says, I think currently now the Minister of Gender gets about 0.2% of the national budget, which means it's probably just for, the human capital to just be there. But even when the laws are put in place, how can they be able to disseminate those laws into the local context in languages that people get to understand? So when NGOs and international organizations are seen to be put in the forefront to support this, it's now when it's seen as it's a Western thing. So poverty issues, our social norms, and now also awareness that what violence is as well. Now that NGOs are working, I feel like that is why the numbers keep on spiking a little bit more.
All right, so we will come to the advocacy in terms of the 16-day activism later on. But let me go to Celine Dion, right? What our special journalist, our guest stated initially, that all these laws, right, started from South Africa. So let me go to Celine Dion. South Africa remains a society profoundly marked by violence and continues to grapple with enduring effects of decades of institutional racism, sexism, exclusion, structural violence, and other factors that have persistently undermined human development and positive social cohesion. The country contends with some of the globe's highest homicide, and some suggest the country has one of the highest of GBV, encompassing intimate femicide, rape, IPV. Now, in 2022, President Ramaphosa acknowledged that GBV is a severe socioeconomic problem, which is fundamentally rooted in unequal power dynamics between men and women. Violence against women has been acknowledged as a national crisis and a second pandemic that is increasingly not just as a national issue, but also as a serious human rights abuse and increasingly important social public health concern. Now, a report by UN Women published on November 22nd, 2024, titled Tackling Femicide in South Africa Through Laws, Policies, and Better Policy indicates that globally, every 10 minutes, a woman was intentionally killed by her partner or family in 2023. In South Africa, 5.5 women killed by intimate partners per 1,000 women between 2020 and 2021. Right. South Africa has come up with all kinds of laws, which I can mention. The National Council on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Bill, which was passed in May 2024, the National Strategic Plan on GBVF launched in 2020, the National Council on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. So we have all kinds of laws. Now, various research shows that there is prevalence and no evidence as suggested by Professor C. Davis, whose article that I sent to you of Johannesburg University, that progress toward the elimination of GBV has been made in all 9 provinces in South Africa. Why is that the case? With all these laws declaring GBV as a national pandemic and a national crisis, why is it still a problem that no progress has been made in this direction? Celine Dio. Yeah, can you hear
Greetings,
me?
everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, I've been in and out. I'm struggling with network. Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So
Can
I'm
you hear me?
asking that, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I hope I understood because you were cutting in between, but I got some of the information you were bringing forth and the question. So in my reading of the paper that you
All
sent,
right, I can paraphrase what I just said to you, right? That
yes,
South Africa has a history because of apartheid, right? And don't forget, from our special guest, most of these laws against human rights and women's rights came from South Africa. Now, recently, we know that the president declared what GBV as a national crisis and a pandemic. Despite all these laws that have been passed, the question is, why is it that something which is considered to be a national crisis and a pandemic with all these laws, why is it that Davis is making the argument that there has been no progress in tackling GBV in South Africa?
Hi, can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Hello?
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Celine Dio, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Oh my God, it seems like we're going to struggle here. Can you hear me?
Indeed, we can hear you. We can hear you.
You can.
Carry on.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
carry
Okay.
on.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So it is true,
All right,
although
so
there are so many laws
can we go to our
that are
special
put in.
guest, Seodi? Can you help us, right? Given the history of South Africa, right, coming from apartheid and being the pioneer that came out with some of these laws, right? Why is it that after all these years of passing all this legislation, the narrative that I sent to her is an article or a report written by a professor at the University of Johannesburg, who is making the argument that what no progress has been actually been made, even though GBV is considered to be a national crisis and a pandemic in South Africa. Why is that the case in the case of South Africa case study? Saudi, if you can help us, because we are not hearing from Celine Dean. So if you can help explain what accounts for the lack of progress.
Hello?
See, you know what? I can hear Cindy. I don't know, Professor, if you can't hear, but I can hear Cindy.
No, I can't hear her.
Oh, you can't hear her?
No.
But I can hear her. Try to speak again, Cindy. Let's hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can
now?
hear you now.
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
can hear
yes,
you now.
yes.
Yes,
But
okay,
you know
thank you.
what it says on your screen? It says that your bandwidth is low. You just have to know that your screen is saying Sindile Ngobo's network bandwidth is low.
Okay.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna try. I hope I succeed. Let's just pray it happens.
Yeah, but carry on. Yeah.
I do agree with the. Thank you for accepting the request to participate. So I am joining as a GBV activist, and a Black feminist, and a student,
We are
a
expecting
PhD
Africa
student.
to have a better internet
I mean, my
network, right?
is up.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Oh God. I do agree with the author's statement in that South Africa has not really made much progress with regards to the protection of women, despite the rights that are put in place to protect women. I mean, as we speak, the South African nation is still reeling from an incident that
All right,
occurred
Cindy,
on the
we can't hear you at all.
Hello.
Okay, so since we can't hear, so can you help us why we are having this lack of progress in South Africa?
Can you hear me?
I wish Sindile would answer that, because I wanted her to answer being a South African.
South
but
Africa, correct? Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
and also I can hear her, and it looks like Christy Banda can also hear her. So
Yeah,
maybe
I
it's
can
just
see
you,
Brave also
Prof.
said can hear. Yeah.
Yeah. So let Sindile try again. Let's see. Try again,
Let me
because I can hear her.
Okay, let me try again. So I do agree with the author's
Irene, can you
submission.
hear?
I can hear her.
Yeah, let me find out from Irene. Irene, can you hear?
No, I cannot. There was a time I
Oh,
could.
you can't.
Yeah. But yes. I'll maybe make a suggestion to Prof to try maybe mute your camera to at least maybe assist her with the bandwidth, so that at least maybe that could be better. Let's just try that.
Okay.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yep.
let me go on.
Yes, okay. So I'll start all over. So I'm joining the conversation as a anti-GBV activist, a Black feminist, and a PhD student whose focus is on GBV in South Africa. So I do agree with the author's submissions that despite the multiple laws put in place to protect women and children against violence, the issue of gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa is skyrocketing or mushrooming. As it is, the South African nation is still in shock and reeling from an incident that occurred on the 17th of December, just a day after the end of the commemoration of 60 days of activism, where a Black man in rural South Africa, I wouldn't say stabbed, so I'd say slaughter, because it looked like a slaughter, even though it doesn't seem appropriate to say human being can be slaughtered, but a young man named Sibusiso Lawrence killed his girlfriend, and he captured the incident in an image and a video, which he then posted on his Facebook page, and he leveled various accusations against his partner. So I think 3 days after the incident, news outlets also reported that another man performed a similar ritual, if I may. He killed his girlfriend, 21-year-old girlfriend, and a young child, and then he proceeded to hang himself. So it does seem that although there are laws in place to protect women, but the issue of gender-based violence is persisting more than ever. And this is after in 2021, as you mentioned earlier, the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, along with the International Women's Forum of South Africa, launched a gender-based violence and femicide response fund to address the biggest blights in the country, gender-based violence and femicide bill, to militate or against gender-based violence and femicide. The violence against women continued more than ever. So when I read my paper, from what I've gathered, what I can attribute to these ongoing incidents of violence is the fact that our South Africa is still very much unequal in terms of gender and economic stratification. And I'd like to go back to a point by Ms. White, where she mentioned that a woman's rights are tolerated. Like, I find that there's an attitude there's a very negative attitude towards women's rights, and a negative attitude towards women's rights in South Africa. But however, because there is a constitution that is aimed at protecting
Linda, are you there? Yeah, I think we've lost her, but at least she's giving us a little bit background. So sorry, can you help us in the case of South Africa? Why, with all these laws and declaring GBV as a pandemic, right, are we still experiencing this increase in GBV in South Africa? What could be the reason why?
Okay, I was muted. Now I feel confident to say something because I wanted some of the events to be said by a South African.
Right.
Yeah, rather than myself, because I didn't feel it was in my rightful place to say, so those events, some of these events are better said by the owners of the country. So thank you very much, Sindile, for your info, and I'm sorry that your internet is not helping you today, but thank you for sharing with us some of those tragic events. I saw this on Twitter and my heart broke, and it wasn't the first time that I have seen such kind of cases in South Africa. It's really heartbreaking. Having said that, I think we are at a juncture as a continent, not just South Africa, and maybe the pressure is more on South Africa because we regard South Africa as a well-resourced country. South Africa, Egypt, these are countries we look up to as more industrialized than the rest of us, Morocco. Yeah. And because some of these things, they are so open, and we hear about the trauma that's coming out of South Africa. But it's also in the whole of Africa. We are at that stage whereby law reform in of itself obviously is not enough. I think as activists, as women's law practitioners, of which I am, we need to move from the spirit of pushing for enactment of laws only to the next stage, to look at the practical strategies that countries have that ensure that the laws that are on paper are implemented. In countries like, for example, the United States, it's so difficult to pass laws, particularly these human rights laws, as you know. So, for example, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women remains, is not ratified by the US.
Yeah.
That's because the ratification means it's becoming into full law, and they have to, clearly, government has to put funding behind a law. The Americans are not good. They don't pass laws without having a fund behind them. So Congress, I'm not saying it's a good thing that the CEDAW is not ratified. I'm not saying that. It's a push we all want, because we know once the CEDAW is ratified by the United States, it will have a good ripple effect on all of us.
Absolutely.
So it's in our interest that the United States ratify CEDAW. But we also know that they only ratify when there's money behind. So Congress, once it passes, there's a budget behind. Whereas in most countries, and now since we're talking about Africa, and more particularly Southern Africa, when we activists, when we women's law practitioners push for law reform and are successful, what we haven't done is to push for a budget behind that. We assume and hope that government will do the right thing. And as you have said, Professor, government is run by human beings. And at the end of the day, there are also interests, various interests. So sometimes the interest can be to look good. A member state can say, let's pass this law so that we look good among our international friends or among our people. Sometimes it's not even international friends. So for example, in the case of South Africa, where a tragedy as such has happened, if there was a law in the offing relating to the same, government would want to push it so that it looks good among its people. In Malawi, that's what happened when we pushed for the Prevention of Domestic Violence law. In 2006, after starting to push for it in 2006, January, like now, we had 3 deaths emanating from domestic violence. And we pushed government to say, if you had passed this law years back, this would not have happened. Government wanted to pass the law to look good, and they did. But we shouldn't have stopped there. We should have pushed for implementation, asking for budgets, asking for action plans, asking for strategies. But whether it's an action plan or it's a strategy or it's a policy or whatever it is, we need to ask for a budget behind that action plan so that we can follow through. So if it's about training police officers, if it's about training the judges, these days you can go to court, at least in the case of Malawi, go to court with regards to a domestic violence case or even any other GBV case. The court will pretend to hear it, but they'll not pass judgment. It takes years. We've had a recent scandal where it's become revealed that judges are not passing judgments. Obviously, we need to train these judges. We need to change some laws regarding how judges work, whether here in Malawi or beyond. That as a judge, your independence does not remain with you doing whatever you want. Your independence is your thinking, not doing whatever you want, because you're accountable to taxpayers' money. So there are all these trainings that we have to do for our stakeholders. The same with South Africa. And South Africa is more pressed because we look at South Africa as, the fully resourced country compared to some of us. And if South Africa starts, we will also follow.
All right. Thank you very much. Let me go back to Irene, right? So Seodi mentioned the issue of strategies, right? Now, we know Malawi has a national gender policy of 2015 and a national action plan to combat gender-based violence in 2014. Now, we know about the 16 days of activism, right? Now, some people consider it to be more or less of an event, right? Not something where there's concrete action because of lack of political will. Do you agree to that? It's more because people take on the street and they march this year. Next year they're going to march. Next year they're going to march. So they are marching and marching. So it is more of an event of more than something more practical, more realistic, right? Do you agree with that assertion made by some people that we've been marching since 1991?
To be honest, I do say I partly agree to it because yes, the goodness is that when we have 16 days, we highlight to say that this is what's happening, but then it sometimes, yes, kind of feels like it's just a show. After the 16 days, everyone goes away. And usually in such events, what usually sometimes happen is you have this huge budget. Every organization wants, like Seodi says, the law is passed to, to show face. So organizations will come in, pumping money to show face that, we are part of this. I remember having a discussion with someone to say that, if you look at the amount of money that is spent across Malawi on 16 days of activism every year, what if we start saying that instead of having the actual launch in person where people go with allowances and everything, we say that the money, every organization that says they work on gender and GBV, pump in this money, and then we start building safe spaces. Because if you look at Malawi, one of the issues that we have now is that, yes, the person will go and report, you're trying to protect that person, but there's no safe space that you can take them to. Yeah. Yes, organizations are actually doing, livelihood activities where women are empowered to have finances, but they still get to go back to a house where a man is going to violate them either way. So now that kind of support, they go like, you know what, I'd rather just stop. I do not want to be part of this. So what if we now find other strategies of commemorating the days to say that in this year's 16 days, this is what we did. We built a shelter in this district that's going to support women. And then you have your statistics to say, okay, how is it saving women? How many women are being saved? And the financial part that was being talked about in terms of government, when you ratify laws, you need money that's there. In Malawi, the government will tell you that they have a gender responsive budget, yeah? But if you say you have a gender responsive budget, in the health budget, how many women, how many boys, how many girls, how many people with disabilities have access to this? How do you prioritize to say that this money is going to sexual reproductive health, maternal health? Most times it's usually said, I know previously it was said that, government puts in 40% of the funds and then 60% of the funds coming in from, development partners, which then does beg the question to say that if we're lobbying for 16 days of activism, during 16 days of activism, can we now start questioning government to say that, okay, if you say you have gender responsive budgets, in the GBV cases that have actually arisen in finance, in actually the education space, in the digital space, how much has government actually spent on it? Malawi recently also has now like a data protection policy. For me, I find it to be good because now if you're harassed online, you can actually report. But still, there's that issue of the repercussion that comes to it. Looking into the whole, we live in a community, so everyone will be like, you've reported a person, they've lost their job. How do you feel as a person? So when we have 16 days of activism, we've got these norms that we need to look into. It's not just supposed to be an event where it's colorful, you've got clothes, people have got clothes, they've got messages, and then you go back and it's business as usual. It's not supposed to be business as usual. Like Seodi said, 30 years down the line, we needed to not be having this discussion. We needed to be talking about the success stories of the work that was done 30 years ago and started 30 years ago has been bearing fruits. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Let me come to Cindy, right? What do you also think about the narrative that the 16th day for activism is more or less an event instead of something concrete? What do you think about that from the perspective of South Africa, given your activism over there? Cindy.
Hello, I hope you'll hear me this time around. So one of the questions I have around the 16 days of activism, which is commemorated from the 25th of November to the 10th of December, is why do we specifically celebrate or commemorate, 16 days of activism from the 25th of November to the 10th of December, when violence against women and children occurs throughout the year? I think that's a very important question. So then it goes to corroborate or confirm the point I supported by Ms. White, that the issue of gender specifically or women's rights in particular, and children are much more tolerated. They're not taken seriously in our country. Yeah.
So just switch off. Okay. Still not charging.
Let me come to you, Ms. White. Right? Now, this program is supposed to be serving as a bridge between those in the African diaspora and those on the African continent. In all these discussions, right, we have not brought into perspective how the African diaspora can play a role, right, in terms of education, in terms of bringing awareness, information, because I can tell you, people in the diaspora don't see this thing. Look at, they are not even listening to the news. They are not listening to the African Union. They get up, they go to work, they're thinking about how to survive in the United States, right? Go to work, come home, make it a living. That is what they are thinking about. How do you get the African diaspora in terms of citizen and stakeholders engagement? How do we get their seriousness, right, to be engaged in this advocacy?
Thank you very much, Prof. First of all, you've just done it. You yourself, Professor, you are a diasporic African, based in, NYC, and here you are engaging me, a Malawian based in Malawi. We've never met. It would take maybe another, I don't know how long for us to meet, but this is what this reveals. we have an economy that is based on information. It's a different world, even from 10 years ago, to be honest. 10 years ago, we didn't have this instant, like in the way it is. Maybe, yes, there was Skype, if you remember what Skype is.
Yeah, Skype, right,
you know, yeah, Skype, you know, and all that. But I've been in this business for 30 years, and I've worked with a number of Africans in the diaspora. 30 years ago, it was letters, posting. Then it became faxing, where you fax and say, let's write a paper jointly, or let's have a conference jointly. Then it moved from faxing to emails, and the world opened up so easily. And that's when there was a lot of travel between those Africans in the diaspora and Africans living in Africa, you know, because of emails. Now the world has even changed. We don't even have to travel. You know, we can engage in discussion. So in an information-based economy, the opportunities are so huge. They are so huge. You know, at the end of the day, we as Africans, we have to learn to reconnect and engage. So one way is this kind of having webinars sharing. Another way is having joint publications. Another way is actually you traveling here with a project, me traveling there. I mean, when I say me, I'm not saying me personally. I mean, everybody in this everybody in this forum, you know, traveling there. I have taught for the past how to say, maybe 8 years at UNC, because of the connection I have with an African, a Kenyan friend, a Kenyan for colleague, where I would travel. There was a time I would travel to UNC, then it stopped, then we would do it online, where I would teach her classes. I haven't done that in the past 2 years, but I did that for 8 years. And we met because she came to Malawi at one point. We decided to have this project, and I would come teaching at the UNC, and she would come to do research, because at that time I was a researcher, and she didn't have access to villages. So you can imagine, you're a diasporic African, you want to conduct research. How do you enter a village in Malawi? You know, someone has to take you there. Otherwise, you're going to get yourself in trouble. So I would take her to villages to collect data and all that. And there it is. It is not complicated. It's just the will, particularly in this information economy, where you can get information, share information at the click of a button. We have no excuse. So I think for me, I know a lot of African colleagues here, sitting here in Africa, who would want to work with diasporic Africans. I don't think it's true that African colleagues don't want to work with diasporic Africans. I think people now are more curious than ever to collaborate. So that's what I would say.
Go ahead, finish your thoughts.
Yeah, that's what I would say. Yeah, no, I finish.
All right, so we are ready to welcome questions from our participants, if you have questions. But let me go back to Irene, right? In your activism, have you been collaborating with any kind of diaspora organization in terms of the 16-day, or in terms of how to tackle all forms of violence against women? Have you been engaging with any of the diaspora organizations, if there is any?
Not organizations per se, of course, individuals. And also, I think in my line of work, we get to work with different countries as well. So we've had engagement, and I've had engagement. I remember I got linked by a Zambian living in the UK to say that they had seen that we were working on flexible working modalities for women at work, breastfeeding mothers, and setting up a care room where women can bring their children to work and be able to breastfeed at work. So they wanted us to share how we got that done and how we got to that point. And also engagement also with queer women outside Malawi who've left Malawi to work with queer women in Malawi. So we've had sessions of where issues of safety and security for queer women in Malawi. Yes, it's kind of a little bit hard to have like that space where you are corroborating to know that, okay, who's doing what in what country, and who's in the diaspora, that we can actually get to engage. But already me being here on this space, I would say that's one of the issues, because a friend of mine reached out to say, oh, there's this event that's happening, would you be able to be a part? And for me, I think what you're doing is actually great, and if replicated, it would actually be good, as the AU is now trying to look into the documents and the charters to work on them. I know engagement. I remember the last time that we went to the EU, they mentioned that they were doing stakeholder engagement, but already like Malawi was not part. But this kind of sessions could actually help to bring about that sort of engagement and say that, look, in this country, this is what's going on. Yes, there's this political space there in the AU, but then these are the issues that are down right there. If you're developing something that's supposed to be uniform for all countries, also look into these different issues that are there in the countries. But like Seodi said, we're mostly facing the same issues. Like Africa is a whole big village where we have similar kind of issues that are happening in as much as we're in different countries. Thank you.
That's right. Before I go to Celine, somebody sent a question. A question comes from Brighton. He's asking, you've highlighted the issue of domestic violence against women and girls across Africa, and specifically Malawi. But have you considered growing case of violence against men and boys in Malawi? Instances such as women locking men out of their homes, coming home. So, would you respond to that? You see, the focus has been on what? Women and girls, right?
On women,
right.
Yeah, women and girls. Yes, I have seen the comment. I think it's from Bright Makumba.
Correct.
And over the years, I've heard these, if I would say, complaints that men too suffer from domestic violence. And in this particular comment, he actually talks about women locking men out of the house for coming home late, or pouring hot water or porridge on them are becoming more common. Now, I don't want to invalidate his point. I think his point is valid. What I've always advised men, and I will advise, is to say, your experiences are valid. You need to come up with advocacy strategies to engage the country or the community about some of the challenges you face. In the same way as an African woman, as an African professional, I risked everything to start challenging state power from a women's rights perspective. You know, because people don't realize that it's a risk, that it's a price you pay for the rest of your life. They think just because we're talking about marital rape, everybody's like, yeah. They don't realize that the society will always judge you for the rest of your life. I always thought that it would end 20 years ago. It hasn't ended. I'm still carrying the stigma of being a women's rights activist, if I can use that word. The same challenge. Men also have to start engaging to tell us about their lived experiences as African men.
Most men consider it to be a sign of weakness.
Isn't that the, you know, and most women considered it to be a sign of shame, but we had to overcome that. You understand? That's what I'm trying. That's why I'm giving the story. I don't want sympathy, and I'm giving the story of, you have to understand that it comes with a cost, because even for us as African women, it has come with a cost. Challenging state structures and power, it comes with a cost. Personally, I don't want to bear the burden. Personally, I'll speak myself, of doing it for men, particularly with the kind of power you men have, the privilege of being a man and masculinity. And you want me to start fighting for your battles? No.
All right, let's go to Celine, right? In terms of your work, have you been engaging with any diaspora organization, CSO, in your work? Celine, if you can hear me.
Hello. Hi.
Hi, we can hear you. We can hear you. Carry on.
Okay. Well, I've yet started, but what actually piqued my interest around the issue of gender-based violence is my environment as a school teacher. I'm a high school English teacher, and I work with young kids, and sometimes a learner would just break down in class and they would just confess to, you know, an incident of rape that occurred. And I always wondered, like, how do you help that young person because South African schools are diverse. So some schools do have social services to support learners who are victims or survivors of rape, for example. But in our case, we really don't. So those are some of the things that really inspired me to, advocate for the protection of women. And recently in December, I visited a shelter for abused women, just to get a sense of what is happening. And so I've already asked the owner of the shelter to involve me. So that's the only thing I've done so far. And in addition to that, I am, as I mentioned earlier, I am a PhD student, and I am looking at gender-based violence in South Africa from a literary perspective.
Time is fast spent, right? But I think I really want to say something. I want to bring an issue up over here, right? So the point is that I have done a lot of research. Like I told you from the beginning, I did some consulting work for USAID and the Kofi Annan Institute, right? Even as an academic, right, who knows the issue, I was feeling reluctant to host this particular program on GBV. The first series that we have on West Africa, somebody else had to co-host. Last week, somebody else has to co-host. So even though I'm the researcher on this particular issue, I feel very reluctant to host the program, right? Because I feel like this issue is very, very sensitive. So Irene, looking at me, who knows the issue, feeling this reluctant to host the program, just imagine a lot of men over there who you want to get involved in advocacy. Don't you think it's like a hurdle for most men to be involved in this advocacy, given my own practical experience I'm sharing with you now?
All right, I think I'll start from responding to Brighton. Seodi actually responded most to it, but what I would want to say is the problem is that men do not understand that patriarchy as a system does not discriminate when it wants to violate you. So even society, when society sees you as a weaker man, you're going to face it the same way. So an example was before I joined this session, a few minutes, like maybe 10 minutes or so before, there was news that came in to say that 2 women had sexually harassed a mentally unstable man, undressing him and touching his genitalia, and then they've just been charged with indecent assault. And I put a question to say that, is that it? Is that how our laws are put in place? So from a human rights perspective, to say that men should now also stop to say that what about us? Come to the table and discuss with us, because you need to stop talking about the angry woman, because that angry woman has been trying to fight for women to be empowered, which also gets to lessen the burden for you to provide. And men do not get to see that at all. And in the circle of violence, like you were saying, in the circle of violence where a man that has faced abuse or has seen their mother being abused in the household, they have a likelihood of doing the same to another woman. So the more of what about me? What about me? Why don't you come to the table and, like Saudi say, put yourself on the spot, fight along with us, be called an angry man, be called a sissy if they want. Come together and make the change with us, and not just wait for women to fight, because would rather not be called the loud woman, but have another man come with us and say that, you know what, we are fighting for the same thing. We want every human being to have the equal rights, to get the resources that they need, to be represented in the same way, and not to be violated in the same way. But if we keep on, what about us? What about us? It's not a fight against men. It's actually just a fight to say that as humans, let's treat each other equally. So Brighton, when you're ready, please to come and join us. It's very fun to be called names. We've actually accepted it. That's how society is going to call us. But it's not like we're going to stop, because one day at a time. So Woody mentioned that she started 30 years ago. 30 years ago, I was just a toddler. And here I am. There were other women that fought for us to just be here in this space. So we'll keep on fighting so that the next generations to come should say that there were other women that fought for us. So maybe be that man that other men will say that, you know what, they fought for us, so that we can be able to also not face GBV. So Prof, put yourself on the pedestal as well. continue doing that, because now you're also changing the narrative. It's not supposed to be something that we need to start pulling men, you know, we need to start spoon feeding. I think that spoon feeding has been done for the longest time. It's now time for men to also start taking action on GBV. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Let's come back to Seodi, right? There's a question from Luca Kemba, right? He said, well, not that men cannot talk on these issues of GBV, but as you previously put it, issues of GBV are human rights issues. And unfortunately, they have where female face in most platforms, such that even when the men report, they are not taken into consideration as reports from women. How do you respond to that?
Thank you. First of all, I think Alinafe is going to make me cry about, you know, it's very, very pleasing to see another whole generation take up the mantle. You know, I think that it gives me hope, to be honest. You know, of course, sometimes you feel, where are the young people? Where are they? Why should we continue just be the only voice? So when you hear, you know, Alinafe of this world speaking in the manner she's speaking, it's very, very pleasing. So I just also wanted to say that, you know, it makes you feel like it's not a lone fight, and it's worth it. And it's worth it. Yes, yes, that's right. About the issue of men, yes, security, you know, violence against women, they're all human rights issues. But don't forget, it's a story. It's a story that has to be told about the realities on the ground. I speak the realities because I've been there. I've worked with women. I'm a woman. I know what it is. I have the authority to speak as an African woman on this issue, because you can't, because there are people who've been challenging me to say what you're telling me is a lie. It can never happen that a person can do this to another person. I've had to stand up over a period of so long to say, this is the reality that women face, particularly African women like myself. I am asking those, because I've been on the ground, that this story has to be told by those who experience it. Even today, when women go and report, today, they're not believed. So don't be surprised that when a man goes to report, he is not believed. Of course he's not believed. That is why you need strong voices to speak for you. In the same way, I chose to speak for women, because I could see that when they go to the police station and report, they are not believed. To this day, they're not. If a woman comes through my door now and says her husband beat her, I would think twice to say, oh my God, now we have to go to the police. And I will know that I'm fighting. I will know automatically that, okay, they'll not believe me, they'll not believe her, they will try to embarrass us, and they'll try to bury the story. I would have boxes of ticking. Now, because I have learned how to deal with it, I have to deal with it. So it's still not easy for women. And for men, for those who are experiencing the power of patriarchy, because as I have said, patriarchy is a power structure and it tackles on the weak. You know, so even a man will not be believed, but that's just the way it is. You have to pick up the game and fight for other men if you want. But I can assure you, it is not going to be an easy battle.
All right, thank you.
It's hard.
Much.
Yeah, it's hard.
Time is fast spent. So let's get your closing remarks, Lindy, right? What do you think we should be doing forward now that we are approaching the African Union Convention in February? What do you think we should be doing now before February, and what we should expect in terms of what they will be able to come out with? Your closing remarks in that respect. Celine, let's start with you first. Well, if you can't hear me, let's go to Irene. Irene, going forward, knowing that we'll be very soon, we'll be dealing with the African Union.
Oh, sorry, someone is interrupting and I can't hear you. I think someone is. Patrick,
Alex, can you meet the person for? Yeah, go ahead, Irene. Go ahead.
Please, can you repeat? I barely
Yeah, I'm
could
saying
hear.
that going forward, right? What should we be doing as we approach the African Union February Convention? What should we be doing more, right, to sensitize people, right, in terms of engagement? Because the African Union engagement, citizens and stakeholders engagement ended October. The people weren't aware. I was in the diaspora. Most people in the diaspora didn't know something like that was even going on, right? Now that the deadline is passed, which was October 2024, now we are going into the convention in February. What should we be doing now, right, to bring awareness to this issue before they come out with their convention in February?
Now, like Seodi said, we moved from the letters. We are now in the digital space, so we can start using the digital space to make our leaders aware of what's happening. I know the younger generation uses hashtags, so tag leaders, get together different countries, speak about the same kind of issues that are needed in terms of security and safety. What are we looking at? Because to be honest, if one country has war in Africa, more than 4 countries are going to be affected by it. Already now, like the issue of Mozambique, where it's not gotten to that yet, but people from Mozambique are already moving into Malawi, some are moving into South Africa. The issues that are going to happen there. So we rely on each other. So we need to have one voice, go to the like the media spaces, and not forget the local masses. Because if you look at these conventions, to be honest, the rural people do not even know they exist. They don't even know what these documents say and what it means when the documents come out. So those of us that have this kind of knowledge, we need to already start thinking of how will we be able to translate the same to the rural masses so that they get to understand what's coming, and also when it comes, it should be easy for them to get to understand what's going on. So using of the digital spaces and also engaging the rural masses is what we need to be doing.
All right, thank you very much. Right, so Lindy, let's get your closing remarks in terms of what we need to be doing. Yeah, go ahead. Let's get your closing remarks in terms of what we need to be doing.
So I was thinking about the question when I was preparing for the seminar, and I was just thinking about how we can use the mass media to counter narratives about gender inequality, not just the mass media, but gender inequality, the soapies that men and women watch every day, to speak to the gender inequality or gender-based violence. So recently, I think late last year, South African, I think the South African audience were actually shocked when popular soapie Skim Sam, which is set in the South African province Limpopo, tackled an issue of rape, which was very sort of misunderstood for most people. Audiences were really challenged because they felt that, I mean, they have a different perception of rape, or consent, rather. So the issue also goes to show that most people are not unaware of what constitute rape, So I think the mass media as a whole, it's the same way that colonialism and apartheid use mass media to form various conceptions about African people. The same way we can use the mass media to form conceptions about equality, gender-based violence, and so on. And I was also thinking that maybe basic education and higher education institutions can reinvigorate their curriculums to accommodate the issue of gender equality and gender-based violence. I know there's one of the universities that I attended as an undergrad, University of KwaZulu-Natal, here in South Africa, has paved the way. They've started with a course or a module, a module that actually addresses GV, and I think that's such a step in the right direction.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Ms. White, right? Now, I think the last time we were talking about mass media, right? Using local language. What role do you think that local language can play in terms of education and creating awareness when it comes to the media space, in terms of the closing remarks?
Oh yeah, my thing is open. I was actually just reading Brighty's to advocate. Sorry for the when news effective. Okay. All right. Okay. Localization of
your line is breaking up a little bit. So, yeah.
10 years ago.
Okay.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. You've just reminded me of a paper that I read about 10 years ago. It made such a huge impact on me. It was by Celestine Nyamu Musembi. Celestine Nyamu Musembi. She's an academic, a lawyer, an academic, and she writes very extensively on women's human rights, women's law. And she wrote a paper. I will have to look for it. And I wish if I'd known about this question, I would have read it again. But about the use of, she didn't say African language, but I think she used the word around localization. The need to localize advocacy language so that it has a diffusion element and that it goes on to the people, that no one is scared of rights. Because sometimes the rights language can be alienating, not because of its message, but because of its sophistication in the way it comes through in English or another language, which is not the local language. So it's very important that we design ways, working with people from linguistics, etc., to see how we can localize advocacy to make sure that everyone can understand it in its original sense, but in their language. It's very important. We've done that with politics. In Africa, political language has become so localized, everybody gets it. We haven't done that well with the language of security, the language of rights. The language of rights still feels foreign. And that's part of the problem. I'm not getting off state actors from the budget issue that I raised earlier. They are still under an obligation to attach funding to the laws that they pass. That is the only way these laws can be effective. But at the same time, there's need for even non-state actors, state and non-state actors, to localize the language of human rights, women's rights, so that it is well accepted. I agree with that, so 100%. The last point I just want to make, I know we've hit the 2 hours, is that Bright, he's still talking about, the need for other people to do the work. No, Bright, we have to become allies. Let us all go into the trenches together, not as against. We're all going, because once we see, the issue about rights is interesting. Once you see others fighting for the rights, you jump into the trenches together. And Prof, I also wanted to say something very quickly about your feelings about, I'm a man, how can I engage on the women's rights issue? Some of the people who have taught me human rights language over the years, in the past 30 years, are men, scholars, whom I've sat at their feet, who have studied the system, who have studied the scholarship around rights, and I learned so much from them. One of the things I've talked about, like, what I call myself, strategic gender lawyer. One of the male professors here, actually, when we talked extensively, we talked, we're so exhausted. He said, do you know what you're doing? You are doing strategic gender lawyering. I'd never heard of that term. It came from a male, it came from a male professor, so allies. You know, it's about, it doesn't matter whether it's a man, it's a woman, whether they're Black, Indian, whatever, we all need allies. You can't fight this battle alone.
Okay.
You know, whether our friends in the West, our friends here in Africa, our friends in the diaspora, African, non-African, the fight is too big to be done exclusively.
Right. Thank you very much. Right. Irene, do you have any question to ask?
I was actually commenting to Bright. I had written in the chat to say that what we're saying, like Seodi said, is come join us in the fight. If you look at history, the suffrage movement, if you see the people that signed so that women can get the right to vote, men were also there. It had to take actually that power. Even in Malawi, if we say that, you know, we want a bill or a policy to be passed in parliament, the parliament of Malawi has got more men in it. So we have to find allies in parliament to be able to pass those laws. So there are men that are actually joining in the fight. Brighton, if you don't know, there's men engaged in Malawi, which is actually working on GBV as well. They are allies. The country has now come up with a male engagement strategy, something that was never there. But to see that we need to have forces to fight together, because there are actually also men that are actually discriminated. There are men that are actually facing violence. But sometimes when it's women's voices that are saying that, you know, men also face violence, people start saying that, no, you want men to, you know, to be sissies. They start sending bad messages about maybe now shaming people in the LGBTQI community to say that, I know that man is this, that man is that. So we say that as men, please come and join us. Come and join in the fight. If you don't want to be in the women's spaces, there's men engaged in Malawi. Go and join. There's brother to brother at Zomba with Dr. Chisiza. Join the forces and come together and fight with us. It's not a fight against the other. It's not only women that are supposed to be fighting. We want allies so that we also can hear your issues, because we cannot just speak for you. We want to hear what you face firsthand, so that when we're lobbying together, we know what to say, because we can't just speak from assumptions. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. Right. So it's very tough conversation that we've had for the past 3 weeks. We started from West Africa, East Africa, but when it came to Southern Africa, we decided to look at case studies, take them on case by case countries. So we have Malawi and South Africa. We're thinking next week moving to probably Lesotho and Botswana. That's how we want to look at it, to have a deep understanding, because that is where most of the work was done. Most of us in the West and probably in the East, we didn't really see this thing that very much, but we tend to understand it coming from Southern Africa, right? So I thank all our panelists today, our special guests, Seodi White, Irene, and Selendi for joining us today. We appreciate all your conversations, all your submissions, and some of the the awareness that you think that men should have access to. And we are looking forward to having these conversations, right? Everywhere in public spaces as we approach the February 20 convention in Addis. We hope to see you join us at another time, probably next week, Friday, as we continue with this conversation. Right. So on this note, I say a very big thank you for Sankofa African Affairs webinar, which is organized by Ellen Associate Consulting Limited. This is purely an information and education program. It's a platform where we bring experts together, those from the diaspora and the continent, to share ideas in terms of how to resolve some of the security challenges facing the continent, right? Yeah. So on this note, I say thank you to all of you. We hope to see you next week, Friday, as we move to the other countries, right?
Okay.
Enjoy the rest of
Bye-bye.
the weekend. Bye.
Okay, bye. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.